Welcome to the Veteran Vault, where real stories of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood are remembered and honored. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard and never forgotten, consider becoming a member of the channel and standing with us in preserving their legacy. War doesn't begin with gunfire. It begins with the faces of the men beside you. Before the chaos, we were teammates, friends, brothers in every sense. And when everything fell apart, that bond became the only thing holding the line. Because in the end, you don't fight for orders or flags, you fight for each other. If you've ever stood on a rifle range with a couple dozen people shooting at the same time, you already know how loud and overwhelming it can get, even with ear protection. Now imagine that multiplied on a massive scale. More than 1,000 men firing non-stop, artillery pounding without pause, explosions shaking the ground. You've got Air Force planes dropping 500 and 700-pound bombs just yards away from where you are. The noise doesn't just stay outside your ears, it gets inside your head. It messes with your thinking, makes it hard to focus, like your brain can't keep up with what's happening around you. The next day was even worse in a different way. You couldn't stand up. The moment anyone tried, they became a target. Bullets were cutting through the landing zone so fast it felt like the air itself was dangerous. Everything around you reminded you that survival came down to staying low and staying alert. I was born in Mount Vernon, New York, but most of my childhood was split between New York and Tucson, Arizona. Military service wasn't something unfamiliar in my family. My father served in the Navy during World War II. He was a chief petty officer. So that sense of duty was always somewhere in the background growing up. When it came time for me to choose my path, I ended up in the Army. At the University of Alabama, ROTC was mandatory, so I didn't exactly walk into it blindly. After finishing my studies, I owed the Army 2 years of service. But once I got in, something clicked. I found that I actually enjoyed the life, the structure, the responsibility. What was supposed to be a short commitment turned into a full career. I stayed in active duty for 24 years, and with credit, it counted as 25 by the time I retired. I was commissioned in 1957. Early on, I went through the basic course at Fort Benning, followed by Ranger School and airborne training. Those experiences shaped a lot of what came next. After that, I was assigned to Fort Jackson in South Carolina, where I spent about 2 years commanding basic training companies. Later, I worked in operations, handling planning and coordination. From there, I was sent overseas to Okinawa. I served as part of special troops and eventually became the deputy headquarters commandant. It was a different kind of responsibility, but it gave me a broader view of how everything fits together beyond just the field. Around 1963, things started shifting toward what would eventually lead me into the Air Cavalry. I attended the advanced course, then joined the 2nd Division, specifically the 2nd Battalion, 23rd Infantry. I commanded B Company and later served as the battalion operations officer. During that time, the unit transitioned into what became the 1st of the 7th Cavalry. That's when Colonel Hal Moore came in. I ended up working alongside him for nearly 3 years. We deployed to Vietnam in September of 1965. The journey itself was long and unforgettable. The entire brigade was packed onto a ship called the Maurice Rose. We left from Charleston, moved down through the Atlantic, passed through the Panama Canal, then up to Long Beach where we refueled and restocked. After that, it was a 20-day stretch across the Pacific before finally reaching Vietnam. During that voyage, something unusual happened. The brigade commander called me in and gave me a strange assignment. He wanted the 1st Cavalry patch painted on the ship's smokestack. The catch was, the ship's captain had no idea about it, so we had to do it at night. A few of us climbed up that smokestack in the dark. It was about 40 feet high and wide enough to make it a serious task. We used ropes and hooks, hanging there while the ship rocked back and forth on open water. We painted bit by bit, holding on as best we could. It wasn't easy, but we got it done. The next morning, when the captain saw it, he actually liked it. The only thing he said was we should have added Gary Owen up top. At least by then, we could go back up in daylight if needed. When we finally arrived in Kenon, we moved inland toward Ankei. Some went by helicopter, others by truck. It was about 30 miles along Highway 19, a key route running across the country. When we got there, an advance team had already picked out the location for us, but everything else was on us. We built a tent city from scratch and started running small patrols around the area. At that point, there hadn't been any major engagements yet. Before heading into Landing Zone X-ray, most of what we were doing was routine patrols and waiting for a clear mission. We kept ourselves informed, studying after-action reports from other units like the 173rd and the 101st Airborne. I even went through translated reports written by the North Vietnamese about their own encounters with American forces. Understanding how the other side thought and operated gave us an edge, or at least some insight into what we might face. On November 9th, we received a warning order. The brigade was moving toward the Pleiku area, about 30 miles further up Highway 19. That road stretched all the way toward Cambodia and was a critical target. The North Vietnamese had a clear objective. They wanted to strike the Special Forces camp at Pleiku and then push toward Quy Nhon, effectively cutting the country in half. Our position at An Khê wasn't random. It was part of a larger plan to block that movement and prevent them from achieving that goal. On November 10th, we moved toward Pleiku. Initially, we set up near a former French plantation called Con Tieng, which had an airstrip. From there, operations expanded outward. Units began searching and engaging in areas east of the Pleiku camp, which had already been attacked. That was the situation leading into what would become one of the most intense battles we would face. Everything up to that point felt like preparation, like the calm before something bigger. We knew the stakes were high, and we knew the enemy was out there, waiting for the moment to strike. About a week earlier, there had already been activity in the area, so when we were told to move east, it didn't quite make sense at first. But in the military, you follow orders, even when you don't have the full picture. After a couple of days, the assistant division commander came out to visit along with the brigade commander. We sat down with them and talked through the situation, trying to figure out our next move. Based on everything we knew, we believed the real action was likely to the west, closer to the Cambodian border. The general said he'd take that into consideration. The next day, he returned with a decision. Approval had come through, and we were going to be inserted into the Ia Drang Valley. The brigade commander had a detailed map and had drawn a circle over a section stretching from the Chu Pong mountain area out into the valley. It wasn't a huge space, but it gave us enough room to choose a landing zone. My job was to find a suitable spot. I spent the entire day studying that map, looking for clearings where helicopters could safely land. Ideally, we needed a place where at least 8 helicopters could touch down at once. After narrowing it down, 2 locations stood out the most. One was labeled Tango, the other X-ray. The plan was to do an aerial reconnaissance the following morning before making a final call. We put together the initial plan. B Company would go in first, followed by C and D companies. Once on the ground, B Company would spread out in small units to secure the landing zone. At least, that was the idea on paper. As things turned out, reality had other plans. That night, things were quiet. Colonel Moore and the Sergeant Major decided to get some rest, knowing it might be the last chance for a while. I had my own routine. I usually slept on the hood of a Jeep since the engine kept it warm, especially with the radios running. Sometime around 1 in the morning, I was shaken awake by a lieutenant from the Signal Intercept team. He told me they had picked up something unusual. It was a situation report, the kind where each line contains coded information like troop numbers or equipment counts. What stood out was that each line was being transmitted in Mandarin Chinese. That raised questions. Intelligence had suggested that there might be advisors working with the North Vietnamese units, possibly communicating back to higher command. But the most important detail was where the signal came from. Based on the direction, it pointed straight toward the base of Chu Pong Mountain. Somewhere along that line was the source of the transmission. I thanked him, and after he left, I thought about whether to wake Colonel Moore. I decided to wait. Early the next morning, around 5:30, I told him about it. His reaction was simple. Maybe this time we wouldn't come up empty. For the past few days, we had been searching without finding much, so this was a sign we might finally make contact. We moved ahead with the reconnaissance flight. We took 2 helicopters and flew low, about 20 miles south of Chu Pong, then followed the valley north as if we were just another supply run. We passed through the Ia Drang Valley and briefly stopped near a Special Forces camp before heading back. It gave us a better look at the terrain without drawing too much attention. Once we returned to headquarters near Plei Mi, Colonel Moore gathered everyone and issued final orders. Company commanders, support units, anyone involved was brought in. We set the launch time for 10:30 in the morning. When the time came, we had to delay slightly because the artillery units weren't fully in position yet. About 10 minutes later, everything was ready, and the operation began. Moore was in the lead helicopter along with the sergeant major. There were 16 helicopters in the first wave. I stayed above them in a command helicopter at around 2,000 feet, coordinating everything from the air. As the lead helicopters approached the landing zone, we timed everything carefully. Artillery fire would stop just before they arrived. Then rocket helicopters would sweep in, firing along the edges of the landing area. Gunships flew alongside the transport helicopters, firing into the surrounding brush to keep any enemy forces pinned down as our troops landed. B Company hit the ground first. Not long after, they captured a North Vietnamese soldier and brought him in for questioning. We had an interpreter with us, and when we asked him what was in the area, his answer was direct. There were 3 regiments positioned around Chu Pong Mountain, and they were all there for one purpose: to fight Americans. It turned out the situation wasn't exactly as concentrated as he described. Those regiments were spread out, not all in one place. Still, it was enough to make us adjust our plan. By that time, a company had already landed, and new orders were given. Instead of spreading out defensively, they were told to move directly toward the mountain, where the enemy was believed to be. As they advanced, contact came quickly. North Vietnamese forces started coming down from the mountain toward our position. Looking back, it seemed like a tactical mistake on their part. They had thousands of troops within range, but instead of launching a coordinated attack, they came in smaller groups, one company at a time. That played to our advantage. With support from artillery, airstrikes, and well-positioned ground troops, we were able to hold them off as they came in waves. Each push they made was met with concentrated firepower. By nightfall, things eased slightly. The enemy pulled back for a while, possibly regrouping. Around 6 o'clock that evening, I flew back in with 2 helicopters loaded with supplies, mainly ammunition and water. Water was critical. In that heat, without it, soldiers couldn't think clearly, and that could be just as dangerous as running out of bullets. We managed to get those supplies in, but we knew the fight wasn't over. During the night, the enemy gathered their forces, preparing for a larger attack. Sure enough, it came early the next morning. It hit fast and hard, catching us right as the day was beginning. My radio operator had just started making hot chocolate, and we never even got a chance to drink it. Not long after we secured the landing zone, we ran into another serious problem. One of the platoons became separated from the rest. They weren't lost in the sense of being disoriented, but they were cut off and surrounded. What happened was this. 2 companies were moving forward, each with platoons advancing and one held in reserve. One platoon, led by Lieutenant Herrick, spotted a few enemy soldiers and decided to pursue them, hoping to capture a prisoner. A couple of men hesitated, sensing it might be a trap, but they pressed on. That decision led them straight into a much larger enemy force. They suddenly found themselves facing dozens of soldiers coming toward them. At some point during that encounter, Herrick was hit. The platoon pulled back to a small rise and set up a defensive position, gathering their wounded and trying to hold their ground. Things got worse quickly. Not only was the platoon leader down, but the platoon sergeant and a senior squad leader were also killed. Leadership was suddenly gone, and the situation was critical. That left the responsibility to another soldier to step up and take control under the worst possible conditions. Ernie Savage ended up taking charge, but that kind of situation wasn't something we were unprepared for. Back during training at Fort Benning, we used to run exercises where leaders were suddenly taken out. Moore would walk up, point at someone and say, "You're dead. You're in charge now." The idea was simple. Everyone needed to be ready to step into the role above them at a moment's notice. Because of that, when it happened for real, Ernie didn't freeze or fall apart. He stepped up and took control. That night, even though enemy troops were actually moving through parts of their position, they managed to hold together and didn't lose another man. It was tense and chaotic, but they stayed disciplined. When we first realized the platoon had been cut off, Moore asked what I thought we should do. My instinct was to try and push back out with 2 companies and reach them, but by then it was getting close to dark, and as those companies started moving, they ran into heavy resistance. The North Vietnamese had already come down in large numbers, bringing machine guns and setting up strong positions. There was no way to push through. So Moore made the call to pull everyone back and secure the landing zone instead. Earlier that evening, when I flew in with supplies, I could see something unsettling. Hundreds of small lights moving along the side of the mountain. I remembered reading reports about how they used little lights on the backs of their packs to follow each other at night. It looked like a steady stream of reinforcements heading our way. But as it turned out, they got disoriented in the dark. They had planned to attack around 3 a.m., but they didn't hit us until closer to 6. Meanwhile, that isolated platoon was still out there. When the main attack finally came, the enemy made a critical mistake. Instead of concentrating all their force on the landing zone, they split their efforts. A smaller group kept going after the trapped platoon, while the rest came at us. If they had thrown everything they had at one target, it could have been a very different outcome. At one point, Charlie Hastings told me he had tactical aircraft stacked from 7,000 feet all the way up to 35,000, spaced every 1,000 feet, ready to strike. And when they started hitting, they hit hard. You could literally see waves of enemy soldiers coming in, hundreds at a time, bayonets fixed, charging straight at us. Then the jets would come in low, dropping napalm and bombs, wiping them out in seconds. It was devastating. We were right in the middle of it, about 25 yards from the fighting. At one point, an aircraft dropped 2 canisters of napalm right on top of our position. One went off, and we barely managed to call off the second. If that second one had hit, it would have wiped out our entire command group. The first afternoon and evening of fighting was intense, but in a steady, grinding way. Imagine standing on a rifle range with maybe 24 people firing at once. Now multiply that by 1,000. Add in constant artillery going off just yards away, and Air Force planes dropping 500 and 750-pound bombs dangerously close. The noise alone was overwhelming. It got inside your head, made it hard to think clearly. The next day was even worse in some ways. You couldn't stand up without drawing fire. Anyone who tried got hit. Bullets were snapping through the landing zone non-stop, so fast it felt like the air itself was tearing apart. For a lot of the men, this was their first real experience in heavy combat, but many of the non-commissioned officers had served in Korea, so they brought experience with them. On top of that, we had trained hard before deploying. I had personally worked with many of those soldiers during their advanced training. We weren't thrown into this unprepared. We had built a foundation that helped us hold together when everything around us was falling apart. We weren't just a unit. We were a group of guys who really knew each other. We played football together, softball, basketball. We spent time side by side long before the shooting started. I knew these men personally. One of the soldiers out there, Thompson, had even been my driver when I was a company commander. That kind of connection changes everything. When people ask what you're fighting for, it's not about strategy or territory. It's about the person next to you. You fight for your friends. The level of courage I saw that day was beyond anything I could have imagined. It wasn't just bravery, it was something deeper, something raw and constant. There was a machine gun team out on the line. Sergeant Adams was running it until he was shot in the head. Without hesitation, Bill Beck stepped in, took over the gun, and held that position. He ended up taking out over 250 enemy soldiers. Years later, when some of our guys went back to Vietnam, they met former North Vietnamese soldiers who had been there. One of them approached Beck and asked where he had been positioned. They had a map of the battlefield. Beck pointed to his spot with the machine gun. The man looked at him and said in broken English, "That's too much. That was my position. You killed my best friend. I had just married his daughter a month before." Then he said he couldn't stay and walked away. Moments like that remind you that courage wasn't one-sided. The enemy kept coming, even through napalm, bombs, and overwhelming fire. They didn't break easily. The fighting got so close it turned into something almost primitive. There were instances where our wounded were found on the ground, locked in hand-to-hand combat with enemy soldiers. That's how tight it got. No distance, no separation, just survival. One thing that stands out even now is how close we've all remained over the years. Decades later, that bond hasn't faded. We were together for a long stretch, about 2 years, and that kind of shared experience doesn't go away. My second tour was completely different. Replacements came in one at a time, and you never built that same connection. But with this group, we all knew each other from the start. I remember during the worst of the battle, when casualties were being brought back, Moore gave me a specific task. He told me to look at every single man and write down their names in the small notebook I always carried. He didn't want anyone to be lost in the system if something went wrong later. Even in that chaos, he was thinking about making sure every soldier was accounted for, every life recognized. So I went through, identifying them one by one, doing what I could to make sure no one was forgotten. When I think about what I'm most proud of from my time in service, it all comes back to one thing: taking care of my people. That was always the priority. Looking out for the men around me, doing everything I could to bring them home. And the real reward comes later. It's not medals or recognition. It's those moments when you're at a reunion and someone walks up with their child and says, "I want you to meet this man. He saved my life. You wouldn't be here without him." That's the kind of thing that stays with you. That's what makes it all mean something. What stays with you isn't the noise of battle or the chaos of war. It's the people. The ones you stood beside, the ones you fought for, and the ones you made it home with. Or didn't. Real service isn't measured in medals, but in the lives you protect and the bonds that never fade. And if there's any legacy worth holding on to, it's knowing that when it mattered most, you were there for each other.